The worst thing that can happen in an adaptation is when the creator appears to have read the source material, but didn't really get why people like it. You can just tell when they haven't grasped the essence of something, and the result is always missing that same spark. In general, I want this channel to be a place of positivity, so I mean this video to celebrate something I love as much as bash the movie that ruined it. In any work of fiction, the most important thing is getting the audience to connect to your characters. Even if the protagonist is some dark anti-hero, you want the audience to be on their side, or at least like them a bit. His Dark Materials has this in spades with one of the most endearing protagonists in fiction, Lyra Silvertongue. Today, I want to take a look at a scene that cements who she is and why we should love her in the books, while seemingly totally missing the point in the 2007 movie. Our scene takes place about halfway through the book, when Lyra is adventuring with her friend the bear in the north. All you really need to know for this scene is that everyone in Lyra's world has a demon, which is a physical manifestation of a part of their soul. Listen to how Lyra in the book behaves. This isn't the focus of the video, but also try to pay attention to the quality of the writing itself. Pullman is a master of what he does. "He thinks we are devils," Yorick told Lyra. "What shall I say?" "Tell him we're not devils, but we've got friends who are, and we're looking for... just a child. A strange child. Tell him that." As soon as the bear had said that, the man pointed to the right, indicating someplace further off, and spoke quickly. Yorick Byrnison said, "He asks if we have come to take the child away. They are afraid of it. They have tried to drive it away, but it keeps coming back." "Tell him we'll take it with us, but they were very bad to treat it like that. Where is it?" The man explained, gesticulating fearfully. Lyra was afraid he'd fire his rifle by mistake, but as soon as he'd spoken, he hastened inside his house and shut the door. Lyra could see faces at every window. "Where's the child?" she said. "In the fish house," the bear told her, and turned to pad down toward the jetty. Lyra followed. She was horribly nervous. The bear was making for a narrow wooden shed, raising his head to sniff this way and that, and when he reached the door, he stopped and said, "In there." Lyra's heart was beating so fast she could hardly breathe. She raised her hand to knock at the door and then, feeling that was ridiculous, took a deep breath to call out, but realized that she didn't know what to say. Oh, it was so dark now. She should have brought a lantern. There was no choice, and anyway, she didn't want the bear to see her being afraid. Now, let's look at how the movie handled this bit. Honestly, at this point, it isn't so bad. We don't have any other characters, so we don't get Lyra reprimanding them, but she's clearly afraid of the shed and is working past that. Without access to her inner thoughts, this was probably the best the movie could do. Now, back to the book. "Pan, for God's sake," she said. "Be a bat. Go and look for me." But he wouldn't, and he wouldn't speak either. She had never seen him like this except once, when she and Roger in the crypt at Jordan had moved the demon coins into the wrong skulls. He was even more frightened than she was. As for Yorick Byrnison, he was lying in the snow nearby, watching in silence. "Come out," Lyra said as loud as she dared. "Come out." Not a sound came in answer. She pulled the door open a little wider, and Pantalaimon leapt up into her arms, pushing and pushing at her in his cat form, and said, "Go away! Don't stay here! Oh, Lyra, go now! Turn back!" Trying to hold him still, she was aware of Yorick Byrnison getting to his feet, and turned to see a figure hastening down the track from the village, carrying a lantern. When he came close enough to speak, he raised the lantern and held it to show his face. An old man with a broad-lined face, and eyes nearly lost in 1,000 wrinkles. His demon was an Arctic fox. He spoke, and Yorick Byrnison said, "He says that it's not the only child of that kind. He's seen others in the forest. Sometimes they die quickly, sometimes they don't die. This one is tough, he thinks, but it would be better for him if he died." "Ask him if I can borrow his lantern," Lyra said. The bear spoke, and the man handed it to her at once, nodding vigorously. She realized that he'd come down in order to bring it to her, and thanked him, and he nodded again and stood back, away from her in the hut and away from the bear. Lyra thought suddenly, what if the child is Roger? And she prayed with all her force that it wouldn't be. Pantalaimon was clinging to her, and Ermin again, his little claws hooked deep into her anorak. She lifted the lantern high and took a step into the shed, and then she saw what it was that the oblation board was doing, and what was the nature of the sacrifice the children were having to make. The little boy was huddled against the wood drying rack, where hung row upon row of gutted fish, all as stiff as boards. He was clutching a piece of fish to him as Lyra was clutching Pantalaimon, with her left hand, hard against her heart. But that was all he had, a piece of dried fish, because he had no demon at all. The gobblers had cut it away. That was intercision, and this was a severed child. Her first impulse was to turn and run, or to be sick. A human being with no demon was like someone without a face, or with their ribs laid open and their heart torn out, something unnatural and uncanny that belonged to the world of nightghasts, not the waking world of sense. So Lyra clung to Pantalaimon, and her head swam and her gorge rose, and as cold as the night was, a sickly sweat moistened her flesh with something colder still. "Rata," said the boy. "You got my Rata?" Lyra was in no doubt what he meant. "No," she said in a voice as frail and frightened as she felt. Then, "What's your name?" "Tony Makarios," he said. "Where's Rata?" "I don't know," she began, and swallowed hard to govern her nausea. "The gobblers—" But she couldn't finish. She had to go out of the shed and sit down by herself in the snow, except that of course she wasn't by herself. She was never by herself, because Pantalaimon was always there. Oh, to be cut from him as this little boy had been parted from his Rata, the worst thing in the world. She found herself sobbing, and Pantalaimon was whimpering too, and in both of them there was a passionate pity and sorrow for the half-boy. Then she got to her feet again. "Come on," she called in a trembling voice. "Tony, come out. We're going to take you somewhere safe." There was a stir of movement in the fish house, and he appeared at the door, still clutching his dried fish. He was dressed in warm enough garments, a thickly padded and quilted coal silk anorak and fur boots, but they had a second-hand look and didn't fit well. In the wider light outside that came from the faint trails of the aurora and the snow-covered ground, he looked even more lost and piteous than he had at first, crouching in the lantern light by the fish racks. The villager who'd brought the lantern had retreated a few yards and called down to them. Yorick Byrnison interpreted. "He says you must pay for that fish." Lyra felt like telling the bear to kill him, but she said, "We're taking the child away for them. They can afford to give one fish to pay for that." This is a scene that benefits greatly from the omniscient narrator. A whole wave of emotions roll through Lyra, and we get to see all of them. Importantly, we see fear and disgust and revulsion give way to compassion and kindness. We also see her temper flare up at the greedy villager, reminding us that Lyra's righteous indignation is never more than a step away. Now, the same section in the movie. Here's where things begin to falter. We see Lyra's sadness and pity, but that's all. This could just as easily be a boy who'd been beaten, and the scene wouldn't change. Lyra shows her kindness, but none of the strength of character from the book. Without revulsion to overcome, her kindness doesn't mean nearly as much. It's not as easy to show these feelings in a movie as in a book, but we could have had her cringe away, or flash a look of disgust and then hide it. Something. Anything. This is also one area where the movie is hurt by simplifying the story a bit. The character of Tony Makarios has been combined with the character of Billy Costa. This mostly doesn't matter, but it means that Lyra knows the boy in question beforehand. Instead of extending her kindness to a total stranger, she's rescuing an old friend. It's not enormous, but this slightly undermines the selflessness and courage shown here. Now, let's see how the works handle Lyra's returning the boy to camp. They rose through the village and up towards the ridge, and the villagers' faces were open with horror and a kind of fearful relief at seeing the hideously mutilated creature taken away by a girl and a great white bear. In Lyra's heart, revulsion struggled with compassion, and compassion won. She put her arms around the skinny little form to hold him safe. The journey back to the main party was colder and harder and darker, but it seemed to pass more quickly for all that. Yorick Byrnison was tireless, and Lyra's riding became automatic, so that she was never in danger of falling off. The cold body in her arms was so light that in one way he was easy to manage, but he was inert. He sat stiffly, without moving as the bear moved, so in another way he was difficult too. The bear loped onward. Lyra had no idea how tired she was until they caught up with the Egyptians. The sledges had stopped to rest the dogs, and suddenly there they all were, Farder Coram, Lord Fa, Lee Scoresby, all lunging forward to help, and then falling back silent as they saw the other figure with Lyra. She was so stiff that she couldn't even loosen her arms around his body, and John Fa himself had to pull them gently open and lift her off. "Gracious God, what is this?" he said. "Lyra, child, what have you found?" "He's called Tony," she mumbled through frozen lips. "And they cut his demon away. That's what the gobblers do." The men held back, fearful, but the bear spoke, to Lyra's weary amazement, chiding them. "Shame on you! Think what this child has done. You might not have more courage, but you should be ashamed to show less." "You're right, Yorick Byrnison," said John Fa, and turned to give orders. "Build that fire, and heat up some soup for the child. For both children. Farder Coram, is your shelter rigged?" "It is, John. Bring her over and we'll get her warm." Here, Lyra doesn't actually do very much, but she doesn't have to. She's already taken the actions, and instead, she just serves as an example. Grown men show fear and are shamed into acting by Yorick the bear. I especially like Yorick's phrasing that, "You might not have more courage, but you should be ashamed to show less." It acknowledges that Lyra's strength and compassion are exceptional, even as he tries to wring more out of the men. Now, see how the same moment plays in the movie. Nothing. No one's scared of the boy, they're all just sad. The viewer is given no clue that a boy without a demon is something revolting here. Lyra's courage is essentially non-existent, because there's nothing to be afraid of. Dropping the ball here undermines her so badly, because it means Lyra's act of rescuing the boy wasn't exceptional at all. Anyone who found him would have done the same. Finally, I want to look at a passage a bit later. She saw him coming and sat up to speak. "Farder Coram, I know what it was that I couldn't understand. The alethiometer kept saying bird and not, and that didn't make sense because it meant no demon, and I didn't see how it could be." "What is it?" "Lyra, I'm afraid to tell you this after what you done, but that little boy died an hour ago. He couldn't settle, he couldn't stay in one place. He kept asking after his demon, where she was she a-comin' soon, and all, and he kept such a tight hold on that bare old piece of fish, as if... Oh, I can't speak of it, child, but he closed his eyes finally and fell still, and that was the first time he looked peaceful, for he was like any other dead person then, with their demon gone in the course of nature. They're a-trying to dig a grave for him, but the earth's bound like iron. So John Fa ordered a fire built, and they're a-going to cremate him, so as not to have him despoiled by carrion eaters. Child, you did a brave thing and a good thing, and I'm proud of you. Now we know what terrible wickedness those people are capable of, we can see our duty plainer than ever. What you must do is rest and eat, because you fell asleep too soon to restore yourself last night, and you have to eat in these temperatures to stop yourself getting weak." He was fussing around, tucking the furs into place, tightening the tension rope across the body of the sledge, running the traces through his hands to untangle them. "Farder Coram, where's the little boy now? Have they burned him yet?" "No, Lyra, he's a-lying back there." "I want to go and see him." He couldn't refuse her that, for she'd seen worse than a dead body, and it might calm her. So with Pantalaimon as a white hare bounding delicately at her side, she trudged along the line of sledges to where some men were piling brushwood. The boy's body lay under a checkered blanket beside the path. She knelt and lifted the blanket in her mittened hands. One man was about to stop her, but the others shook their heads. Pantalaimon crept close as Lyra looked down on the poor, wasted face. She slipped her hand out of the mitten and touched his eyes. They were marble cold, and Farder Coram had been right. Poor little Tony Macarios was no different from any other human whose demon had departed in death. Oh, if they took Pantalaimon from her! She swept him up and hugged him as if she meant to press him right into her heart, and all little Tony had was his pitiful piece of fish. Where was it? She pulled the blanket down. It was gone. She was on her feet in a moment, and her eyes flashed fury at the men nearby. Where's his fish? They stopped, puzzled, unsure what she meant, though some of their demons knew, and looked at one another. One of the men began to grin uncertainly. Don't you dare laugh. I'll tear your lungs out if you laugh at him. That's all he had to cling on to. Just a cold, dried piece of fish, and that's all he had for a demon to love and be kind to. Who's took it from him? Where's it gone? Pantalaimon was a snarling snow leopard, just like Lord Asriel's demon, but she didn't see that. All she saw was right and wrong. Easy, Lyra, said one man. Easy, child. Who's took it? She flared again, and the Egyptian took a step back from her passionate fury. I didn't know, said another man apologetically. I thought it was just what he'd been eating. I took it out his hand because I thought it was more respectful. That's all, Lyra. Then where is it? The man said uneasily. Not thinking he had a need for it, I gave it to my dogs. I do beg your pardon. It ain't my pardon you need, it's his, she said, and turned at once to kneel again, and laid her hand on the dead child's icy cheek. Then an idea came to her, and she fumbled inside her furs. The cold air struck through as she opened her anorak, but in a few seconds she had what she wanted, and took a gold coin from her purse before wrapping herself close again. I want to borrow your knife, she said to the man who'd taken the fish, and when he'd let her have it, she said to Pantalaimon, What was her name? He understood, of course, and said, Rata. She held the coin tight in her left-mittened hand, and, holding the knife like a pencil, scratched the lost demon's name deeply into the gold. I hope that'll do, if I provide for you like a Jordan scholar, she whispered to the dead boy, and forced his teeth apart to slip the coin into his mouth. It was hard, but she managed it, and managed to close his jaw again. Then she gave the man back his knife, and turned in the morning twilight to go back to Fadakorum. Here's the moment that tells us exactly who Lyra is. The rage at the men seems totally unjustified from their perspective, but that just establishes the different ways in which they got over their fear of Tony. One way to get over fear is to ignore it, to bury the feeling as deeply as possible and just do without thinking. Instead, Lyra took the far more difficult path. She got over her revulsion by connecting with Tony so deeply and thoroughly that fear was no match for compassion. None of the other humans understood what the bit of fish meant to a boy who had lost everything, but Lyra did. And from that compassion, she feels indescribable anger. How could they not see what taking this boy's last comfort from him would mean? She's even specific that she is not mad for herself. It ain't my pardon you need, it's his. She only calms down when she has the idea of giving Tony a proper funeral rite. Compared to the movie figure of Billy Costa, who was returned to his friends and family, Tony has nothing and no one. Only Lyra to give him kindness and dignity. One last thing that I actually didn't notice until I went to make this video. Here, when Lyra is displaying her righteous anger in full force, Pantalaimon mimics Lord Asriel's demon as a snow leopard. We don't yet know why Asriel does the things he does, but on some level, Lyra has processed that fighting for justice means she is behaving like him. She sees him as working for good even without knowing the stakes of his plan. Now, let's see how this scene is handled in the movie. Nothing. The scene just doesn't appear in the movie in any form. Things need to be cut for adaptations, and that's fine. Something has to go. But it absolutely should not have been this moment. This is one of the most rich character-building sections in any book you can choose, and it was just entirely left out. The other parts serve to tell us that Lyra is kind, but her unyielding sense of right and wrong is so fundamental to who she is. Without the complete moral outrage, she's just another kind person. This leaves us with a movie Lyra who is dull, lifeless, and oh so flat compared to the one in the book. It makes me wonder if the screenwriter and director merely skimmed the novel, because I can't imagine actually feeling the weight of this scene and not making sure it appeared in the movie. How could you fall in love with the protagonist of a book and then just not bother to properly portray what makes her great? As much as this is an indictment of a bad movie, I also want it to be a celebration of something special. The Golden Compass stands head and shoulders above other teen fantasy, and a huge portion of that is Lyra's character. I hope in the future people can understand what makes a work great before adapting it, and so can properly bring characters like her to life. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.